Our introduction to the general public occurred when I was 7 and Robbie was 3. 1950, our parents were arrested. Some of you know this. That night, I stayed up to listen to the radio at 11 o'clock. There was a news reporter, a guy named Lyle Van. He used to do the news every night at 11 o'clock. I stayed up, and sure enough, they mentioned that my father was accused of stealing the secret of the atom bomb and that he faced the death penalty. That was my introduction to the case. In the 2 years between the conviction in '51 and their execution in '53, we were, Michael and Robbie, our parents' children. And then they were killed. And for a brief moment, we were again in the spotlight when people in the New York City Welfare Department, aided and abetted by at least one judge and some people in non-governmental social agencies, attempted to take us away from Ann and Abel Meeropol, the adopted family that our legal guardian Manny Block had chosen for us. He had died suddenly before taking the legal steps to have them, my parents, assume guardianship, and those agencies pounced. And the goals of those who went after us, we are convinced, was to kill our parents a second time, making sure we would grow up to hate them and honor their killers. Luckily, a community of people rallied around us, and they won our family's first victory in court. And that's why Rob and I are named Meeropol. And that's why we grew up to honor our parents and to participate in radical struggles as soon as we were old enough. Fast forward 59 years, and you can tell by looking at me that we are not children anymore. And luckily in the modern era, people like me can be celebrated as senior citizens rather than dismissed as old men. But everything's relative. Case in point, I was a basketball gym rat until well into my 60s. And when a 35-year-old basketball playing buddy was driving down the court playing against a bunch of 20-somethings, a kid on the sidelines referred to him as the old guy. And of course I was playing and I was 55. But I digress. I'm sure many of you are asking yourselves, why are we here? What is the point of this evening? I was at a debate at Swarthmore College back in the 1990s, chaired by Victor Navasky of The Nation magazine, and he noted there was a bifurcation in the audience. There were people my age and older, Victor himself is 10 years older than I am, and a student-age audience, because it was at Swarthmore College. He said, we old folks are here because we can't help ourselves. The question is, why are the rest of you here? And it remains a good question, but I would rephrase it. Why are we of the NCRRC inviting a new generation of people to come and listen to us and perhaps participate in an ongoing struggle for redress? Luckily, I've been given a chunk of time to present that. I have a watch here. And the best way I know how to do that is to tell my personal story. The story of discovery about my parents and the story about what lessons I and my brother, though I do not speak for him, take away from the set of experiences. When we went public in 1973, we believed our parents were totally innocent victims of the McCarthyite hysteria. For those online, particularly for whom this term is a vague historical reference, let me tell you, it was a really vicious time in America. And unlike the raging right wing of today, which we should be justly afraid of, the McCarthyites, which included virtually the entire American political spectrum, from liberal Hubert Humphrey, who sponsored a bill to reopen the concentration camps that the Japanese had been in and get them ready for communists, to manipulative Richard Nixon, to crazy Joe McCarthy himself, they were virtually unopposed. The communist and fellow traveling left, having been marginalized, first by the 1948 elections and then by the Korean War and the spy trials of the early 1950s. In fact, the story of Dave and Emily Ullman and the Committee to Secure Justice in the Rosenberg case is a story of the most incredible existential courage in the face of overwhelming odds to actually accomplish something in McCarthyite America. At least today, we have Occupy Wall Street and even some progressive Democrats to oppose Tea Party fascism. A much stronger peace movement to oppose both the Bush administration and Obama administration's pursuit of the American century that our leaders rightly considered as ours since we beat Soviet communism more than 2 decades ago. By contrast, During the Korean War, there was virtually no peace movement, just a vague undercurrent of dissatisfaction that led candidate General Eisenhower in 1952 to promise that if he's elected, he would go to Korea, whatever that meant. Most people felt he would do something to end the war. My personal story that really exemplifies how the McCarthyism of the 1950s so infected ordinary Americans occurred in 1952, when I was living with my grandmother in Washington Heights near 181st Street and the Harlem River. I had the name Ethel Rosenberg then. I thought it would be great to tell kids in the neighborhood about my parents, so their parents would read the one newspaper that supported them, the National Guardian, and another newspaper that was sort of half-baked support, the Daily Compass. The first parent I tried this on was sympathetic. I was on a roll. The second one threw me out of her house, ordered her son never to hang around with his communist friend, and admonished me never to hang around with her son again. She might have been nice to her children and family, but she was terrified that a 9-year-old would contaminate her with my parents' communism. That's the dark side of the 1950s in a nutshell. When I said we believe my parents were totally innocent, what I mean is we believe they'd never been spies. Yes, they were communists. Yes, Dad committed perjury when he denied in 1945 that he had been a communist. Yes, Mom lied to the press the day after my father was arrested when she invited them into the apartment and dried dishes in front of them. You've all seen the photograph. The day after Dad was arrested, said they were not communists. They know nothing about communism. But we thought they were not spies, and we were right about Mom. As we began to learn a lot about the case, we developed detailed arguments to prove the case the government presented at the trial was based on a tissue of perjuries. Every once in a while, however, someone would ask us, why did they accuse your parents out of the blue? Why did David Greenglass, the chief prosecution witness, a relative, why did he confess to a crime he didn't commit? With 20/20 hindsight, my efforts to explain those two questions were pretty weak. I won't share them with you, unless you press me later. But I also remember being at a house party in 1974 when an old friend said, your parents were communists. What would have been wrong to help the Soviet Union? Wouldn't that be something any good internationalist would want to do? I had a good answer, but one that didn't jibe with the views of most communists at the time. My answer was an anarchist's answer. You should never place your allegiance to any national state. Didn't work as an argument. My father and mother were communists, and I can testify as a former member of the old left, when I was in high school and college, that we really did believe the Soviet Union was creating a new good society. Even after the revelations about Stalin, we used to argue, hey, at least the Soviets admitted their previous bad behavior. The US has never apologized for killing my parents or Sacco Vanzetti. Let me digress again. Even during the 1960s, when there was a new left that was not the least bit enamored of the Soviet Union, many of us adopted Cuba, China, or Vietnam as models of alternative visions of the good society, the alternative for the US. Let's face it, you need to dream of a better world. We all want to think we're fighting for something, not just against what exists today. So many on the new left not only idolize the Vietnamese and Cubans for resisting the onslaught of the American empire, we idealize them, and the Chinese as well. And the reason was obvious. We wanted a concrete image of the something better we wanted to strive for. It's a hell of a lot easier to have a model than to have to invent it in your head. And some anarchists do something like this with the Mondragon collectives in Spain. Tea Party folks do it with America from the 1950s or from the 19th century. It's an unfortunate tendency of us humans. It's only natural. But to get back to my parents and their friends in the 1930s and during World War II. They saw the Soviet Union as a model of a new society. They saw Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan as representing the worst of the capitalist world order. They wanted the United States to be on the right side of the war. And some of you were already thinking, what about the Nazi-Soviet pact? They were confused by it. And the period before Hitler attacked the Soviet Union. Believe me, I had fights with my father Abel about this all the way through the 1960s. Now I have to quote my brother. I do this often, by the way. About why poor working class people during the 30s would come to respect and join communists, and why communists and their non-communist supporters were so willing to believe that the Soviet Union was such a great place, even in the light of evidence about Stalin's crimes. And I'm paraphrasing from memory, but I did watch the YouTube of last year's speech. My parents looked out their window, they saw unemployment, misery, people being thrown out of their homes because they couldn't pay the rent. And they saw communists organizing unions to fight for higher wages, organizing the unemployed to demand relief and jobs. They saw communist organizers responding to evictions by putting people's furniture back into their apartments when the marshals had left. They went on demonstrations, and when the cops attacked the marchers or the picketers, they read in the press, "Communist riot," and the police restore order. Sound familiar, people in the Occupy movement? In those days, they didn't have cell phones with cameras that could prove the press lied. The press got away with a lot of lies. So the communists knew the press lied about what they did in their shops and communities, and assumed, therefore, the press was lying about the Soviet Union. This happens all over the world, by the way. Another digression. Because the official press in the Soviet Union always played up the negative aspects of the US, racism, poverty, cynical citizens of the old Soviet Union who knew their press routinely lied about what was going on inside their country, naturally assumed that everything the Soviet press said about the United States, all the true stuff, was untrue. Historian Erich Foner went to teach at Moscow University after the collapse of the Soviet Union. He marveled how unbelievably ignorant the students he taught in Moscow were about the US. They willfully refused to believe any negative stuff because they'd been fed it by their official media. End of digression. Not every communist, probably not even a majority of communists, thought it would be a good idea to help the Soviet Union by giving them classified information. But in the context of World War II, when the future of the socialist experiment was at stake, those who were in a position to help did. And my father was one of them. It took my brother and me quite some time to get our heads around the possibility that my father had got secret information of the Soviets, and that my mother knew about it, and we assumed supported it. I would say the first piece of evidence that began to change my mind was the surfacing of a guy named Joel Barr. He had been named as part of the Rosenberg spy ring during the trial. He had gone first to Czechoslovakia and then the Soviet Union in 1950. I actually met him in 1990 when he came back. He actually was videotaped on a show. He was a special edition of Nightline with Ted Koppel. Had he been a spy beforehand, he denied it. But the fact that he had been given a false identity when he moved to the Soviet Union indicated he must have been more than a political defector. I had met political defectors in Czechoslovakia in 1965. They used their original American names. We now know he and another engineer who fled to Czechoslovakia and later the Soviet Union were indeed recruited by my father to help. Then in 1995, Soviet cables from New York to Moscow during World War II that had been decrypted in the 1940s and 50s were released by the CIA to much fanfare. Case closed, end of story. These were the Venona releases. Now, my brother and I publicly questioned the validity of the cable. It was not for us to validate the claims of the CIA, but we did begin to seriously consider whether, in fact, the substance of those revelations might be true. We speculated in print about the significance of what if they were true. And if you want to follow a little bit of the speculation, in 1995, very soon after the release, I gave a talk at Vassar College called the Matthew Vassar Lecture. And I just noticed, if you Google it, you can actually see the text of it. I didn't reread it for today. But I sort of balance between it might not be true because here's the reason, it might be true, here's the reason, and if it's true, this is what I think. It's a very weird position to be in. Then Morty Sobel stepped up and told the New York Times that he had engaged in espionage with my father. And he even admitted that they did it a bit after World War II. And this was followed by the publication of Walter Schneer's posthumous work, Final Verdict, which I highly recommend. If any, I mean, we used to say, read Invitation to an Inquest, a big, long treatise on the case. Now, you know, in these days when people read things on the internet in 5 minutes, read Final Verdict. It's shorter, it's like a one-sitting read or a one-day read, and it really, in my opinion, and my brother agrees with me, it really tells basically what happened. Everything fell into place. We didn't have to argue that there were ambiguities, as for example I did in my daughter Ivy's film, Heir to an Execution. We could explore the full implications of what happened. And for those of you who know this already, please bear with me. I'm going to give you a little summary of what we believe happened. My father convinced a number of his friends who were involved in science and engineering to help him get information to the Soviet Union beginning in late 1941. He recruited people, helped get that information to the Soviets, and late in 1944 he recruited a very enthusiastic Ruth and David Greenglass, my mother's brother and sister-in-law, to help. David was at Los Alamos, where the first atom bombs were made. In early 1945, my father was fired from his government job for being a communist. The KGB, fearing the FBI might be on to his activities other than being a communist, cut him out of the loop. Walter Scheer calls this my father's pink slip from the KGB. Thus, when David Greenglass, this is very important, when David Greenglass delivered information on the atomic bomb, first to a courier, Harry Gold, then directly to the Soviets, my father and mother had nothing to do with it. And here's where government misconduct comes in. Here's where breaking and entering becomes terrorism. Here's where a technical violation of the Espionage Act to help an ally in wartime becomes treason. David Greenglass confessed as soon as the government questioned him. He made a decision to cooperate in exchange for making sure his wife wasn't arrested. Some of you know this. He said to the FBI, "If you touch a hair on her head, I'll commit suicide and you'll have no case." And then he went ahead and built the case against my father and then ultimately against his own sister. That way he made sure he didn't face the death penalty, but in his confession he embellished on the role my father had, reduced his and his wife's involvement. The stories of the role of both my parents in the Greenglass Gold connection and later in September 1945 delivering atomic information from Greenglass to my father to the Soviets, those stories that were told at the trial were all false. Of course, those stories about atomic secrets, and forget for a minute that Greenglass turned over some pretty much useless stuff, those stories were centerpiece of the government's efforts to obtain the death sentence. Why did they want to obtain a death sentence? Sometimes life imitates art. Some of you may recall a passage from the E.L. Doctorow novel, The Book of Daniel, where the lawyer for the Rosenberg fictionalizations, Isaacson, tells his son the death penalty was an investigative technique. Great line. Only a novelist could write that line. Why did they want to obtain a death sentence? I quote from a memo from a man who later became Chief Justice of the United States, William Rehnquist. In 1953, he was just a law clerk on the Supreme Court, but in a memo to his boss, Justice Robert Jackson, he noted that the death penalty was imposed as a warning to communists. Then he commented gratuitously that it was too bad drawing and quartering had been outlawed. You can read this in the New York Times, July 27th, 1986. You can't make this stuff up, folks. But equally important, the government wanted names. The names of everyone my father had recruited. So first question, why was my father not another David Greenglass? I believe it's false to suggest that he was just some wild-eyed communist idol. Think about it. He'd gotten his friends into this. They'd done it together. They'd grown up together. They'd gone to college together. It was an act of personal solidarity with his friends. I got my friends into this. I'm not going to put them where I am. Why didn't my father confess what he had done, deny what he hadn't done, and refuse to name names? A Canadian scientist, Alan Nunn-May, had done just that. When confronted with evidence against him in 1946, he confessed. And he did it, he said he did it to help mankind, making sure the Soviets had the same weapons the Americans had. This is exactly the same reasoning of the American scientist Theodore Alvin Hall, whose story is told in the book Bombshell. He was never even arrested by the FBI. Nunn-May, after confessing, refused to identify his contact, refused to name names. Well, one reason Nunn-May was able to do this is that under the British Official Secrets Act, he wasn't subject to the death penalty. In the U.S., as my brother so carefully showed in last year's memorial, there is an Espionage Act of 1917, an act that specifically does an end run around the treason clause in the Constitution, promoting breaking and entering into terrorism, promoting violation of the Espionage Act into treason. All of a piece. Treason is defined in the Constitution as making war upon the United States, giving aid and comfort to her enemies, and most important, absent a confession, you can only be convicted of treason if there are two witnesses to the same act. Because of the Espionage Act, however, my parents could be considered traitors without the protection of the treason clause. A federal district judge in a lawsuit Robbie and I filed once actually in writing referred to them as having been convicted of treason. And when our lawyer wrote him a letter and said, hey, you know, they really weren't even indicted for treason, his response was, oh, it's the same thing, isn't it? Yeah, it is the same thing, except without the protections of the treason clause. Espionage in wartime, even on behalf of an ally, becomes treason 5 years later. It was the prospect of the death sentence, here I'm speculating, that probably led my father not to attempt the Alan Nunn-May route. The David Greenglass route, not in his character. I love the quote from Miriam Moskowitz, who's sitting right here in my daughter's film. She says, don't talk to me about such things. I can't think that way. I think that was my dad's reaction right from the start. And I think he and my mom were genuinely horrified at what David Greenglass did, because until the moment David Greenglass confessed, he was a strong communist who argued that what he was doing was something that was kind of honorable, what he and Ruth were doing in helping the Soviets during World War II. And I won't tell you my source, but even after he got out of jail, he talked glowingly about what a great place the Soviet Union was. What a great thing he had done by helping give the bomb to the Soviets and creating mutually assured destruction. You can read it in Sam Roberts' book, The Brother, which, don't buy it. Take it out of a library. Don't buy it. The reason, David Greenglass gets some of the royalties. Some of you know that.
If you buy it used?
If you buy it used, you may be safe, right? I don't know. Good point, good point. You can always buy it used. Yeah. Or, I am on tape, but steal it. All right, so, speaking of my mother, as early as 1975, when some FBI documents were released as a result of an FOI lawsuit my brother and I had filed, as early as 1975, we discovered that the evidence presented at the trial, that my mother typed David Greenglass's handwritten spy notes, that evidence had been fabricated, first by Ruth and then David a few weeks before the trial, in direct contradiction to what David told the FBI and therefore presumably the grand jury. Let's all pray for his speedy death, because once he dies, the grand jury testimony of him will be released, just like his wife was released after she died. In direct contradiction to what he told the grand jury in 1950. With the release of the Venona decryptions, we learned for sure that the U.S. government knew my mother wasn't a spy, because she had not been given a code name. In an FBI memo, the arrest of my mother is explicitly justified as a way of using her as a lever against my father. It didn't work, but it put the government in the same position of a hostage taker when confronted with the need to kill the hostage to demonstrate they mean business. In June 1953, the government murdered the hostage. Since the government wanted names, my father would have been confronted with them refusing to release my mother unless he betrayed his friends. So what's he going to say? I did this, but not that, and by the way, my wife was not involved. How's that going to play with a jury in 1951? Better to hope that the weaknesses of the government's case, most of it built on an issue of lies, would lead either to acquittal or reversal on appeal. And they built a record when it was reenacted in 1994, the American Bar Association, with a real federal judge, the initial trial record, plus subsequently found information, and actors playing the defendants and witnesses. As a result of that reenactment, with real proofs of perjury at the original trial, 2 six-person jurors of ordinary New Yorkers found them both not guilty. A story that was not reported in either the New York Times or USA Today. In fact, my brother, Robbie, was on vacation. And he didn't attend the week-long mock trial, but when he read nothing about it in the New York Times, he turned to his wife and said, "We won!" And of course he was right. So I've told the story of Rob and my changing opinion. I've told what we believe to be the true story of my father's involvement in espionage. I've tried to make sense of why my parents chose the route of total denial. But I still haven't answered the question, why are we here? Why have we invited the whole world to watch in cyberspace? Why are we still talking about this case after so many years, so many changes to what we know? With all the other issues involved, war with Iran on the horizon, danger of the survival of the planet, where does this struggle fit in? What is the call for redress all about? I'm going to try to do it in 5 minutes. I can't do better than to echo my brother's arguments from last year's meeting. My parents' case is a textbook example of repressive prosecution. Even when a defendant is guilty, breaking the rules only sets the government up for successful prosecution of innocent defendants. Second, because the government wanted a death penalty to force my father to name his friends, they were happy to permit David Greengrass to pin all his atomic espionage on my father. They were willing to permit Ruth Greengrass to persuade David to commit perjury in delivering the typing testimony about my mother. Government misconduct affects us all. Jay said it earlier. It affects the immigration rights movement, it affects the Occupy movement, it affects the animal rights movement, it affects the labor movement. In any and all these situations, politically motivated prosecution, especially those which use conspiracy indictments, are always possible. Even when defendants are guilty, non-guilty associates can be swept up in the process. Miriam is a perfect example. She and her employer, Abe Rothman, were what I like to call collateral damage. You know, not involved at all, except they happen to know Harry Gold and Elizabeth Bentley. Bad luck for them. Next time around, choose your friends better. That was stupid. I made a joke and now I lost my place. In addition, and this worked particularly well, as Jay pointed out, the breaking of a law, say letting an animal loose from a cage or breaking a window, suddenly becomes a terrorist act, conjuring up mass murder. A real but small crime can be remoted to a dastardly one by a vigorous prosecution aided by scared witnesses caught up in a possible conspiracy indictment. All resistances of a peace. We welcome everybody into an effort to expose government misconduct in the case, to demand some form of redress. There'll be a variety of ways to try to do that, and to link all movements, because as Jay so eloquently pointed out, we really are all in this together. Thank you, everybody.